Okay, welcome to the Introduction to Built-Up Roofing webinar. Okay, now what we're doing here is we're just kind of going back to basics here. Now we're going to focus on basic information, pretty much going to a Phase B type mentality or Phase B level of learning. So we'll go to our next slide here, and we actually have our learning objectives. Okay, our first is recognize the basic components of a built-up roof system. Okay, so the first is surfacing, then we have flood coat, then we have plies, then we have bitumen and adhesive. Okay, and we're going to go into the details of each one of those. And our second objective is to describe the basic differences between these components. Okay, so again, we're going to go through each one of these in detail, and you'll be able to tell me why one is different from the other. Okay. First, to start off, a little bit of history and the definition of a built-up roof. Built-up roof membranes, you also hear them referred to as BURs or BURs. They've been in use in the U.S. for more than 100 years. They're commonly referred to as tar and gravel roofs, okay? So you'll hear that reference out there a lot, but when you get into the details, you'll understand that there's a difference between tar and asphalt. And, you know, obviously you handle those in different ways. But again, if you don't know or if you don't have the focused learning to know the difference, you're just going to describe it as tar and gravel. Okay, and the definition of a built-up roof, it's composed of alternating layers of bitumen and reinforcing felts that create a finished roof system. Okay, so again, the components of a built-up roof, there you have it in the larger picture on the screen. It's a photo of a built-up roof. You may have seen it once or twice before on our marketing literature. And to the right, you have an expanded view of the different components there, okay? So here's that illustration with some arrows, and that gives us the different components of the built-up roof. So on the top there, you have your surfacing, okay? In this case, it is aggregate, and we'll get into more detail in the next slide here. Then underneath that, we have our flood coat. Then we have our plies, and those plies are adhered with bitumen / adhesives, okay? Okay, so number one, surfacing. Let's go into some details here. So surfacing is considered the protection of the roof system, and that's actually part one of two. Now, aggregate, again, is the most common, and that's just aggregate broadcast over a flood coat. But you'll also see some built-up roofs finished with an emulsion and loose granules or aggregate, or you'll see coating, a finished coating on top of the system, okay? So not every built-up roof has aggregate and a flood coat. So there are other options there, okay? Second, our flood coat. Now what's that? That's also considered as protection of the roof system, part two of two. So basically the surfacing and the flood coat protect the plies underneath, and we'll get into plies here shortly. Now, as a lot of you know out there, flood coats can be applied in hot or cold, okay? And if you look at the photos to the right, you see different application methods, okay? There's two hot applications, and then there's one cold, the larger one in the middle there. And there are several different ways to install the flood coat. You'll see some out there with a squeegee. Again, the guy in the yellow hat there, or yellow hard hat, is using a spray rig. The lower right-hand corner, he's using a hot mop, and etc. So there's different methods, and there's different combinations of ways to install the flood coat. Okay, so next we have our plies. Okay, now the plies are considered the reinforcement of the system, or you can also say it's the source of the tensile strength, or the main source of the tensile strength, okay? Now, what different types of plies do we have? Well, the first one we list there is a composite ply. Now, what is that? Basically, it's a polyester glass, polyester tri-laminate reinforcement coated with a waterproofing asphalt. Okay, so it's not just your typical glass, which we're going to get to next, but it's actually reinforced glass with polyester. It's a reinforced glass and polyester scrim coated with a waterproofing asphalt. And most of you who have cut into these can tell the difference between that and number two, a glass ply. Now, what is a glass ply? It's just a fiberglass membrane coated with a waterproofing asphalt. Okay, so again, those are the ones that you could bend easily with your fingers and they would crack. The composite ply, not so much. Okay, and lastly, we have our polyester. Okay, and that's in our lower right-hand corner, that white roll going in there. I think we're actually putting that down in an emulsion. And what that is, it's just a heat-resistant polyester roll or film or membrane that, again, you can put down in hot or cold. Okay, next we have our bitumen or adhesive. Again, those words can be interchangeable sometimes, so that's why we put bitumen/adhesive. And what is that? That's considered the waterproofing agent of the system. And again, when you're talking about a built-up roof, the bitumen or adhesives can be applied in hot or cold methods. And we talked about there are several ways to install these. Now, one thing we did want to highlight is there are different formulas in the bitumen and adhesives, okay? So not all black or not all cans of black stuff or kegs of black stuff is the same, okay? You have different formulas or different types. You'll have like a type 2 or a type 3 asphalt. You'll also, like we have listed here, you'll have different formulas of a cold adhesive. Like say one will be solvent-free, one could be low odor, and then we have the standard, or we also have our water-based, and more you're seeing our adhesives with recycled content in them. So again, there are differences between the buckets of black goo. Okay, our next slide here is how we have, or basically how a built-up roof is installed. Okay, so it's your cutaway / detail. Now, if you start in the upper left-hand corner, you have these rectangles here. And basically, this is your first layer of insulation. It's a 4x8 foot board. That's your base layer. The top layer, again, the top layer joints offset the base layer, and those boards are 4x4. Okay, so here you have your big boards, and if you go past this dashed line over top of the big boards, you'll have the 4x4s. Okay, so after you have those two layers of insulation installed, then if you go underneath, you can start putting your system down, okay? Now these first two or these first three plies here are actually considered your stripping plies, okay? So your first is a 12-inch. Again, we go for redundancy. So you have your 12-inch in an adhesive. Then you have your 24. And then you have your first full length, which is 36-inch. So your typical roll is a 36-inch wide roll. Okay, so once you get your first three stripping plies in, then you could go ahead and put your 3-4 ply system down. Okay, so every other one of these sheets represents 36 inches. Okay, and again, that's called shingle fashion. Now, in the lower left-hand corner here, these are your surfacing options. Okay, so this first one in the lower right, that could be your emulsion or flood coat with loose granules broadcast in it, okay? Again, we said not every built-up roof has to have an aggregate surfacing, okay? So that's why this first option here, those little circles are smaller because those are loose granules adhered in an emulsion. The second one is a coating, okay? We installed, say, for example, this system would be 3 plies and a coating system installed over top of that. And then you have your finished system. And lastly, in the upper left-hand corner, you see some larger dots or larger pieces here. That is your typical aggregate surfacing roof that a lot of you have seen out there already. Okay? Okay, so again, the components, let's go through these again real quickly as we wrap up here. The first is surfacing. The second is flood coat. Third is plies. And lastly, we have bitumen adhesive, okay? And of course, underneath that, in our illustration here, we have 2 boards and a metal deck underneath that. Again, what did we learn? Now we're able to recognize basic components of a built-up roof system. And one more time, those 4 components are surfacing, flood coat, plies, and bitumen/adhesive. And we went into the details of the differences between those components, okay? So if you had a chance to go through this entire webinar and you feel like you know all this information, go ahead and take this quiz, okay? Now I'm going to try to put a link underneath this video, but if you cannot click on the link, go ahead and type this in your browser, okay? http://quiz.quizcode.com/34535. Okay? All right, that's all for now. Thanks for attending this webinar.